morning, please turn with me to Matthew chapter 22. 22 as we look at the subject this morning, the end. And hopefully, maybe we'll be able to work it in clearly, the sub-theme of winning. And before all that, there's an announcement to make because it appears as though somebody's alarm is going off in the parking lot, and it is a Gray Ford Escape. Gray Ford Escape, in case you want to look in on your car. I understand the message is going to be so compelling that, okay, maybe not. But there we go. So now he's joining the winning because his car alarm was not very low. Right? There you go. All right, but with that, try to make good on my promise to be better about going through 7 chapters since you see. I have been very stubborn, as the elders once again have given me the invitation, don't preach so much. And, right? One way to fix that. And right, that's my reinterpretation, brother. I'm sorry. Conversation went a little bit different, of course. But I was like, no, it's broken, but maybe God can fix it. I don't know. So we're going to try this whole 7 chapters thing again. And I'm going to just do a better job of summarizing. And this sermon is really going to come out of 3 chapters, and that just makes it a whole lot better, right? No, but we're going to try it and see what happens, right? And so in these 7 chapters, we have started the descent of the plane, as we say. We're trying to land it. Chapter 21 was the triumphal entry. And all of these things are really going to sum up for me in the end. And of course, it's a forced theme. It's not literally coming out of the chapter. But in chapter 22, after the triumphal entry, we saw the division in the crowd between those who were yelling Hosanna and those who were not so much happy about the things he was doing, even though they were described as wonderful things. But all of that is going to come to an end in chapter 22, where all of the questions they're asking them are going to be asking Jesus are going to be turned on them with one simple question. Whose son is the Christ? A question they're not going to be able to answer. Because they're going to be able to answer him, but not adequately. Because he is going to basically get a good answer from them. He's the son of David. To which he's going to ask another question. Okay, how is it then that David calls him Lord if he is actually his son? And that's going to end the discussion. We're going to go back to that because there's a really important point, at least I see in that, the way he concludes that discussion. But that is, if you look at the very end of that chapter, after that, they're not going to ask him any more questions. But if you've ever had an argument, you will understand that the end of the argument don't always mean the end of the dispute. And so what happens in chapter 23 is he is going to help them understand where the continuing malice is actually going to lead them. In the famous chapter that issues 7 woes to the Pharisees, right? And so after he's going to tell them what the end is going to be for them, he's then going to expand that out in chapter 24 and say, just like we talked about from time to time, my relationship with you does not just affect me and you individually. It's going to have some consequences for the city in general, Jerusalem, and the nation as a whole. So then in chapter 24, he's going to talk about the end of the age, 2 ages, because the sun is setting on this period in Israel's history, and it's also going to give him a platform to talk about the end of all things. And so he's talking about the end of 2 things in chapter 24, prophesying for them once again. As chapter 25 is going to turn back to that whole use of parables, he's going to start to tell them stories again. This time those stories are going to be, lo and behold, about the end of the world. And so it's not all those, the 2 ends. It's not the end of Jerusalem and the end of, it's just going to be the end of all things. And there are 3 famous parables he uses. The parable of the 10 virgins, the 5 wise and the 5 foolish, the parable of the talents, and then likewise the parable of, not really the parable, the last one's just a story. Final judgment, the sheep and the goats. So it's what we call, one of my instructors, I call them mentors from time to time, recently passed on not too long ago. I used to call it a triptych if I hadn't used that term before. Because there are probably at least 3 times in the Gospels where he's going to tell 3 stories back to back to make a single point. You can get the lesson out of one of them, but they're really best understood together. And so he uses 3, once again, was the common theme. Last week, or Wednesday, we talked about the sun is the common theme in some of these parables. The end of all things is the common theme in chapter 24. Chapter 26, then shifting. There's going to be a great battle. And right, it's going to seem to be the great showdown in Jerusalem. They finally find Judas, convince him to do him dirty. But there's a larger battle that's going on because this one's going to include both his apostles and everybody. Because now we're going to see that division that was existing within Israel, whether you're going to look at Jesus from the perspective of what's the worst I can see, or what's the worst I can find. The glass half full perspective is going to be a little bit different, as we said before, because not everybody who was with the chief priests and the Sadducees all made the same decision. Some of them came to Jesus in a way that actually touched his heart. And so we're going to see that division in those who were looking at Jesus from a more pessimistic perspective. But even within his apostles, the question that he got from the rich young ruler helped us see a division between those who saw the best in Christ. Because just having the glass or looking at the glass as half full isn't going to be enough. Because what's going to happen is his own disciples are going to have a real, we'll call it come to Jesus moment. That's too cheesy, but they're not thinking cheesy. And so basically they're going to be confronted with the fact that after the Lord's Supper, it's not just Judas that has to worry about betraying him. Because he's going to remind them of a passage from the Old Covenant. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. That's you, he's going to say, to their protestation and denial. They don't believe it can be them. And so the challenge that the entire nation and the entire world is going to have to face is, like we said before, I am super happy when God keeps me in situations where I can look good. When the sermon seems like it's coming together super well, or life just seems like it's, yeah. But his ministry started out after his baptism. Who remembers? What was the next thing that happened to Jesus? Tempted. And where he was tempted right at home? Out in the wilderness, right? And so that's the division we're seeing in the lives of his apostles in some ways now. Now he's carrying them out of comfortable places into places where they're not so ready to handle the struggle yet. And so they're going to doubt that they can really be as weak as all those other people they've seen turn their back on Jesus. But the good news is, toward the end, as we get through Matthew chapter 27, we're going to see that they're at least not in a place where they are allowing their doubt to turn into denial. Because once we get to a place where my doubt becomes more fixed, then I can begin to dismiss everything that does not fit with my expectation of what is going on. And there are two dangers in that. I can either be too optimistic in life and just want to get rid of everything that tells me my day is going to turn down just because I just like it where it's at. Or I can be so pessimistic that I'm getting rid of all the information that's helping me understand how there is hope in a situation that is otherwise bleak. And so what he's helping them do is find balance so that they are not so far taken away into either perspective that they can't see where God is trying to lead them. And so that's ultimately going to be super important because by the time you get to chapter 28, it's his resurrection, right? And they will have scattered from him. And the cool thing that I saw this time, maybe I didn't understand it before, was when he tells them at the tomb, after the angel has rolled away the stone they tried to guard to make sure the disciples didn't steal in the way, is he actually meets some of the ladies on the road. I think it's the two Marys on the road to tell the disciples, meet me in Galilee. He says, tell my brothers to meet me in Galilee. Those same 12 who had turned their back on him, Judas now being dead. So that's super important for me in terms of my lows in life. It's super important for me to understand where God is leading me. Because it's a lot easier for me to trust even the bad news that he has given me if I understand, like we said before, it goes to motive, the point. Sometimes he's breaking bad news to me so that he can get me into a genuinely more healthy place. Not just a happy place that depends upon the situation I'm in, but like we said, it's cheesy. The peace that surpasses understanding. The kind of emotional stability that survives really tough times. And that's what I'm striving for because I'm not there yet. That's where I want to get. And that seems to be where he is leaving his disciples, helping them to understand how do you get to a place where you're genuinely happy. You don't have to ignore the prophecies about me saying, yeah, I'm going to die, right? You don't have to reject that in order for your mood to be in the right place. You can hear him talking about dying and still see how he can use that for something helpful. And with that, let's go back through the sequence and hopefully how long was that? All right, back in chapter 22 for me, please. If we look at chapter 22, and I'm probably going to have to summarize a lot of this in the way of story if I'm going to get it done effectively, but basically what's going to happen is, as we mentioned, it's the continuation of three parables that he has used. Not the three we mentioned before, the ones about final judgment. But he has three parables. One in chapter 21, two sons. We talked about that before. Two sons are told to do something. One says, yep, doesn't do it. The other says no, gets it done. He's talking about the religious leaders at the end of in Israel at that time. Then he's going to tell them another parable about them in the form of the parable of the tenants. And that's likewise going to catch their attention. They're going to be like, wait a minute, he's talking about us. And then likewise, in chapter 22, he's going to finish up that third part of what seems to be a triptych about a parable of the wedding feast. And the one thing we saw as being consistent in those parables is each one of those has something to do with a son. The parable of the two sons, literally he's talking about two sons. In the parable of the tenants are trying to take the inheritance by killing the son. And then finally, in chapter 22, where we are this week, the parable of the wedding feast is talking about the way in which he offered an invitation to the wedding feast of his son, an invitation that was rejected by those who were originally invited, but the blessing was, it's like we talked about, half full. He was then going to extend the invitation out to those who weren't originally on the guest list, kind of that whosoever will mentality. But the thing that is going to begin to distinguish these two groups is basically if you look at the response in verse 13 or 15 of chapter 22, the Pharisees are going to respond themselves with three questions. And it's not just the Pharisees. It's going to start with the Pharisees in verse 15. It's going to pick up with the Sadducees in verse 23. And a single Pharisee is going to come back at him in verse 34. And the thing that we noticed on Wednesday night about the difference between these three groups is the lines of division had been really well set already by now. But these three all get different answers. Why? Because if you look at verse 18, when the Pharisees ask him a question about taxes, he's going to literally call them hypocrites in verse 18. Likewise, with the Sadducees, when they're asking him questions about marriage in the afterlife, he's literally going to call them, in a term that I'm superimposing this term on the passage now, he's going to call them ignorant in verse 29. But Jesus answered them, you are wrong because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. But with that one Pharisee that comes with the end, he seems to come with a different perspective, which is one of the things that's taken me so long to learn in life. We talked about it before. There are times when I might have to have a difficult conversation with someone. But it's one of the reasons why it's so important to understand what one of our brothers said up here in the prayer, actually. God, help us to love one another. Because even if I have to have tough conversations, if it's one thing for me to have, have you ever heard of customer service courtesy? It's a term I made up. You probably didn't hear about it because I don't know if I made it up. But I started noticing the difference over time of going into stores where people had to either do sales or deal with people for a living. And they were really nice, right? But that didn't mean I was going to get quality service. Because if behind the courtesy was not a genuine love and concern for the thing that I was going through, I was just going to get a smile and a really polite no. But you know you've been cared about if somebody smiles, welcomes you in, and actually takes you and helps you actually fix your problem. That's the difference between love and customer service courtesy, right? There are some times in life where you would do away with the customer service highs if they just fix your problem, right? It's almost like going to what they call one of those hole-in-the-wall restaurants. They might not have the best trained wait staff, but at the end of the day, if the food is amazing and you don't get sick, I think like that now. I've been overseas. That's a win. And so you really need both, ideally, the service, the courtesy, and the genuine love. And that's what we're about to find out here. This guy's a Pharisee. God has every reason, or Jesus has every reason, to be bitter with this guy just because of his history with them. But the insults he has in the first two parables are absolutely missing from what he does or in the way of a response to this Pharisee. And we see it all over the scriptures. On Wednesday night we talked about it. Paul was a Pharisee. Who else? I forgot all the ones we went through. But we went through a whole list of folks. Oh yeah, Nicodemus went to him at night. Pharisee. This young man, Pharisee. Rich young man. Right? All the reasons he had to be angry with them. But he understood one of the things I'm trying to learn. Each according to their ways. It's literally over and over. When we studied this week, I forgot how many times it comes up in the scriptures talking about final judgment. And even more demonstrated in the life of Christ. How he has the savvy and the emotional stability, I want to be there, to deal with each person according to their ways, as opposed to my baggage about the last time, or what I went through before, or all the different hurts and wounds that I have about things that I'm just trying to get over. I might not be getting over them like I need to. And so in that third interaction, that is what we see. We see him giving what seems to be a respectful response to a respectful question in a place where there had otherwise been animosity. But the thing we're going to see, though, is backing up to verse 18, that same verse where he calls them hypocrites. There's going to be another statement that goes to their motives. Jesus is going to say, but Jesus, aware of their malice, is why put me to the test, you hypocrites? And that's the transition to chapter 23. That's going to be a really, at least important point for my understanding at this point, because he is then going to talk about, in a lot of ways, what happens with unchecked malice. That's not what the passage says, but he's through being nice. He was nice to that one Pharisee. But now he's literally going to address this. Verse 1 in chapter 23, then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. And so then he's going to go into the list of do's and do nots, basically in the form of woes. And woes is going to be that repetitive phrase that he's going to use pretty much in all 7 of these woes. He's going to call them hypocrites in 6 of them, right? But either way, he's going to talk about in that section where he gives a pause to call them hypocrites, he's going to talk about the way that they have settled into blindness. And that's going to be really important by the time we get to the crucifixion, because there's going to be a really important distinction. Like one of our sets of 3 before, helped to see that there were one interaction with, I can't remember. I'm trying to go too much off memory. But there's a set, let me just find it so I don't butcher it. There's a situation where he's going to heal 3 blind men. He's going to heal a blind man. And that's going to come at the end of 3 situations in which it is going to look like they are not the most blind people in that circumstance. And the question is going to be, I'm going to have to take a pass on that one. Should have prepared that more, but I'm off on a tangent right now, so I apologize. Bottom line is, there's going to be, I can't remember the first one. Bottom line is, he's going to have 3 interactions. One interaction is going to be with a group who have unhealthy expectations. Then he is going to have a word with his disciples. It's Matthew 20. It's Matthew 20, I'm sorry. Laborers in the vineyard. He's going to tell the story. For the kingdom of heaven is like in verse 1, a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers. We talked about this one before. Why? Because the expectation was, as he went out throughout the day trying to hire laborers, the ones who hired and worked all day were really upset when the ones who showed up and worked an hour got the same pay. We talked about that's unhealthy expectations. They were blinded to the fact that this guy was going to show mercy to the people. We said it wasn't an employment contract, but for that one day, he realized that they were day laborers. And if I worked in farm country before, and I understand day labor. There are situations where the fact that if you don't get to work that whole day, your family might be eating a little bit less that day. And so for that reason, he is paying them based upon that mercy, because that's the principle we have here. Why? Because when you have the law, both the Old and the New Testament are going to say the same thing. Even as far as James, he's going to say, don't deny a person their day labor, their daily wage. We have a hard time relating to that because we work on salary more. But that's the mercy that you see there. And so they're expecting that because they work more, but they were blind to the mercy, just thinking in terms of what they thought was fair. Then next he's going to, after he foretells his death in verses 17 through 19, he's going to get a question. He's going to get a question. And the question is, when you come into your kingdom, can my son sit on your right and your left hand? It's almost like, I said it before, it's like you tell me you're about to die, and I'm like, can I have your car? I know it sounds goofy, right? But that's kind of what happens. Look at the sequence. Because when he finishes up the story, he ends it up by saying, you heard the part about me about to die, right? Right? And he doesn't so much point it back to himself. He's like, understand what you're asking for your kids. And we said it before. You see the crown, but we're not just hiring my favorites, right? We're hiring people who have been through the same things. Hebrews 2 says it. He is not ashamed to call them brothers because they've suffered the same things. And so they want the status, but she doesn't realize that she's asking for her kids unbelievable suffering. And the answer is kind of cold because he says, well, they're going to get the suffering, but I can't give them that position because that's my dad's position to give, right? And so ultimately, then you get the healing of the blind men, the 2 blind men, ultimately raising the question. When his own disciples don't realize what they're asking when they're asking for great status, And he gives a parable of those who are expecting justice without mercy. He said, I'm not sure these two blind guys at the end are the most blind. And ultimately that plays into what we see here with the Pharisees. Because what we're going to see is, just like with that question of doubt, we all have blind spots in our confidence, our courage, and what we understand about what it costs to do all kinds of things. We're here because we talk about the cost of following Jesus. But how many times have you ever taken on a job? And once I got a chance to talk to a brother this morning. Once the honeymoon period wears off, what's it like then? Thank you. You know. I didn't even laugh because you know, right? That's a thing that we experience over and over in life. And once again, I say sometimes my job is just easier if we just connect common things we understand from life to what he's trying to teach us about the scriptures. And what he is doing is he's helping his disciples even understand, as much as you have been walking with me. The frightening part is you don't want to hear that he's about to go away just because you're kind of fond of each other now, right? But you really don't understand what it's really going to mean when you got to answer the questions and he's gone. Wow. And so that's what he's trying to get them ready for, that blind spot in their ministry. Confidence that comes, yeah, we walk with Christ. But what's it like when we're the ones who are having to deal with the questions now on our own? So that is what we're seeing in chapter 23, where he's saying, beyond that, you're in a good place if you have that perspective. But the Pharisees are coming from a different perspective. They're still looking for the worst in everything that he does, and he's telling them in the woes, we don't have time to go through them, but that is going to lead to a place of more and more confusion. Why? Because let's just skip to chapter 26. Because by the time you get to chapter 26, like I said, chapter 24 is going to say it's not just going to have dangerous consequences for them. It's going to have dangerous consequences for the city and the nation as a whole. And in chapter 24, he gives them a chance to, 25, he's going to give those famous parables about the end. But then he's going to go back to real time. It's almost like you see a story bubble in a picture. That's what chapters 24 and 25 are. They're kind of the story bubble about the future and then the illustration of the future. But back to reality in chapter 26, they're still scheming in verse 1, where it's going to read, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the place of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Interesting point there is, if you skip forward to chapter 27. Chapter 27. After, we know Judas is the one who's going to effectively betray him with a kiss. He's going to have regrets, and as he regrets what he's done, it's going to read this way in verse 3 of chapter 27. Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed and went and hanged himself. But the chief priest, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful. I'm done. You get it? What do you mean it's not lawful? You're about to murder a dude legally. But they want to make sure that they spend the 30 pieces of silver the right way. But that's what happens when I become blind, right? And what happens is the root cause of that is what Jesus is warning about in chapter 23. But let's look at 26 to find, this is back up to 27. Back up to 27. This is all out of order, but you already know. So in chapter 27, backing up from where we were, what he's going to do is give us a picture of a key distinction that we see between just kind of everyday folks who are peering in on the process and this growing dispute between Jesus and the scribes, the chief priests, etc. Verse 15 of chapter 27 is going to read, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to him, whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who was called Christ? For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, saying, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." That's the context of, oh wait, it's blood money, we can't buy the field. Understand what that means. It's not like, oh, just lock him up. No, they're talking about killing this guy with no basis whatsoever. Okay, that sounds weird to me. But understand how maybe to all of us, but understand how we got there. Back in chapter 23, the thing that he is warning them about is one of the things that I try so hard to stay away from in my life. And I've talked about it before from a different perspective, because looking at that whole glass half empty, half full perspective from just another illustration, we talked about teams before, right? And what happens is, in my life, when I get to the point where I have settled myself so rigidly onto a team, there's a point in my life when I begin to look at facts as points. And so what ends up happening is, when I get so emotionally invested in defending my perspective, any fact or any truth that doesn't feel like it's helping me score a point for my team, I can't hear that. And so that is what's going on here. You go back to chapter 23, and when he's issuing the woes, a lot of them have to do with the fact that they have now gotten to the point where, just like a brother said, I can't remember who was it that said, God help us stay away from letting our emotions. Who said that this morning? Letting our emotions limit our belief. Is that you, brother? Yeah, limit our faith. And that's what's going on here. See, because it can not only limit our faith, it can limit, as I've said before, it's a dead horse issue, our ability to hear. And here's the problem. Like we said, going back to that whole concept of what was the distinction between the teaching of the Christ and the teaching of the Pharisees? One of the things he points out, going back a few chapters, is beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. But right after that, he talks about what we mentioned before, a week or two back. The reason you have to be careful is because they can interpret the weather, the signs of the day, but they can't interpret the signs of the times. And the thing I neglected to mention that day is, as a teacher, if I've gotten into the mindset that I'm only willing to listen to a fraction of the truth, what have I doomed my teaching to be? If all I can hear is half truth, what can I teach? Just say it. I'm sorry. All I can do is teach half truth. And that's what he's trying to get them to understand. And the gateway isn't, oh, just listen to half the truth. No. He gets me emotionally invested in feeling offended at things that are legitimate and true. And at the point I begin to become offended at the truth, that's where we really see the division coming in Israel. Because it's an emotional reality. That the devil doesn't come in pointy horns. We've heard it before in a red suit. He comes subtly. He comes in those emotional places where I need, right? And so I say it all the time, I'm kind of a loner and a hermit. But that's not how I was born. I was born socialized. I was born to love people. I was one of the happy kids on the playground, I guess. But over time, life beats you into a reality that's a little bit different. And so by the time you get 50-something, hermit starts to feel a little bit better than some of the alternatives of always thinking I can be happy with everybody and that's going to work out good. And so understand, that doesn't mean that my desire and need for socialization has gone away. Sometimes, as we've said before, it makes me vulnerable. And one of the ways I can become real vulnerable is if I believe, especially I'm just going to say it as a single guy. As a single guy, I really start to believe I found that one. Woo, buddy, it's going to be hard to say something bad about her. Right? But there are some people who are more advanced in years who have done some time in marriage, actually living with somebody, who might have a whole lot to tell me that I need to hear before I start getting defensive about her and what we got going on. Right? Please look at it from that perspective, because that's literally what's happening here. It's a different perspective. It's not marriage, but it's the same thing. They need love just like everybody else. The bottom line is, though, you can't put your emotions above your ability to hear the truth. Because at the point you want that relationship more than you want to hear the truth, you are condemning yourself to being a teacher of some fraction of that truth, right? Even if I got 3/4 of it, that ain't enough. And so that's what he is helping them understand. Because even as his disciples, as they want to do the right thing, he's saying wanting to do the right thing, if you ever live, you don't have to live very long before you realize wanting to do the right thing ain't good enough. The road to hell was paved with, thank you, sorry. Somebody told me this. But you know, right? And that's what he's helping his disciples to understand. Even if it doesn't have anything to do with malice, we still got some work to do, guys, because you're about to be on your own, right? And so that's literally what he seems to be talking about. It's the distinction he seems to draw. And so that's one of the reasons why as much as we need an emotional connection, that's normal. That's normal. So much of this Bible is about trying to help us not overcompensate anytime we find an area in our life that may be a little bit lacking. Not to overcompensate so much that I don't need anybody, I'm a hermit. That's me. But trying to be able to more reasonably and in a more measured and a healthy way build relationships. Build relationships that are founded on truth. Why is that important? Is that just because the Bible says truth over and over again? Why is it important for my relationships to be founded on truth? Why is it important? Man, I could really use a new car right now. And I want to go get a new car. No. Better yet, I want to go get a used car. Man, you don't want to get the best deal. I mean, I want to get it at a great price point, but I want to run it as good as new. Am I in an emotionally vulnerable state, depending upon how desperate I am for a new car, right? Right? I could get real gassed up to go get that car. How much do I know when I got my little car? I told you the Toyota dealership stories before, right? I got to be careful, right? Not to go into the dealership and, okay, this is what's wrong with it. This is how you fix it. No, I take it to the dealerships. I don't know anything about cars, right? It's easy for me when my car is broken. Oh, but when I see one, and I've been through this, when it was time for me to get that car. One of the reasons I ended up on that model was I talked to one of the brothers in the church who sold used cars for a while. And he was, in my opinion, if all used car salesmen were like him, they wouldn't have the reputation they got. This brother was trustworthy, reliable, and to this day, I give him a call forgetting that he doesn't have his dealership anymore. But he helped guide me into some things. And when I was buying a new car, he was the first person I thought to call. I don't have that in every area of my life. There are sometimes, I'm remembering a time right now, when having been through that process of buying a car, I had a friend who wanted to buy a car, and they wanted it real bad because it looked great. It fit but under the hood. I was like, did you check this? This was before they had Carfax. Did you do this? Did you do that? And realize that it's one of those times in life where you're asking enough questions where you realize the questions aren't really welcomed anymore, and so you know to just shut up. But I realized, because why? Because I'm looking down on a friend? No, because I've been through it before. I've been through a purchasing process where it looked like it was perfect. And I didn't want the bad news, so I didn't take it to the trained mechanic. I took it to the mechanic who was probably more likely to tell me, go ahead, buddy, buy that new car. That's your dream, right? I tell you what happened anyway. I know, right? Okay, so the story it's time to go. My used car, that's how I learned. I was going to give it, when I was shipping off to the mission field, I was going to give my car away. I bought it used to one of my buddies. And didn't make it to the died. Halfway between Clovis, New Mexico and wherever I was preaching at that time. And what happened was, as good as that used car was, it was still a used car. And so you got to factor in what you're buying, not only the sticker price, but the price of actually getting it up to what your dreams have it as being. And so ultimately, I'm super disappointed if I'm thinking I'm buying that used car and I have the same expectations as what it's actually going to cost as the new car I had before that. No, because I'm trying to balance out. I'm trying to save $1 on the used car. But what I realized, the reason why I ended up getting a new car the next time, was I ended up paying new car price for the used car. Because of all the repairs that it took. And by the time I finally wanted to pass it off, at the age of new car, you'd be able to turn it into the dealership, get a little money back, it went flat dead. Right? So it was a loss, right? And so, but I couldn't hear it at the time because I hadn't been through it. And so that's what's going on here. He's trying to help them understand. I hope, if we go through the Gospels a little further, count the cost of being a disciple. That's real life. Count the cost of marriage. Count the cost of that new purchase. That's life wisdom. That's why I try to start preaching these things from the perspective, okay, what parts of this is actually helping me? And maybe that'll help somebody else too, right? And so with that, there's a lot of practical wisdom we could get to if he just stopped taking tangents. And with that, back to, let me get, oh yeah. And so, I'm just going to probably try to, no, I need to wrap that up. I'm trying to get back to the outline and then just kind of land this plane because sometimes I just got to take a pause and say, God has been good. I can't necessarily say what tomorrow is going to hold. In a lot of ways, I think that fits with this end of the Gospels. The apostles, they don't necessarily know what tomorrow is going to hold. And they're still, by the time you get to the very end of the story of Matthew 28, that passage that our brother just read this morning for the scripture reading, some of them still doubted even at the point they were walking to Galilee. They said, okay, we'll go to Galilee with you, but we don't know if we're going to see anything when we get there. They're thinking dead means dead, quite possibly, I'm sure, even though 3 times, I guess he said, he's going to be resurrected. They still doubt. There's nothing wrong with that. But God willing, they became the kind of people who, more and more, I think, the older I get, it's more I value. Even if I'm not reaching this point, I value the ability, as we said before, to let God guide me into places where I'm not asking for any more troubles or struggles than I have. But once it's certain things, it's one of the reasons why I understand a little bit better why when David messed up, he begged, please don't take your Holy Spirit from me, of all things. There are a lot of things you can take from me, but please don't take your Holy Spirit. Because once you begin to feel what it's like to function at a level that you know is beyond your ability. Like I've been Marcus a whole lot. I've been Marcus a long time. I know my ceiling pretty much, I think. Or I can say, I know my tendencies over 40-something years. And one thing I can say, and this is going to sound all kinds of weird, is I know those times in life where he's taken me beyond what I would normally, or what I've come to understand through 40, 50 years of life as my ceiling. And over time, I've started to look, and the more I read these words, I begin to see that's not an accident. See, I used to work in a field where if I couldn't prove it, I didn't say it, right? Because I didn't want to get laughed at. But ultimately, all I can tell you is from my perspective, one of the differences between me, preacher, and me out in the working world is God was still making those demonstrations in my life out in the working world. But it became one of those things that, like I say, when you have to get up every Sunday and risk public shame and embarrassment all over again, you begin to realize that there are times when it's different when every now and again God shows up in a way that takes you beyond what you've understood your ceiling to be. And when every week, if you're really paying attention, he seems to be supporting you or taking you beyond what you thought your potential was on a consistent basis. And that's one of the reasons why I don't apologize as much for preaching those passages that pushed me beyond where I was. Because I never thought I was going to be a preacher, right? Just like I'm not sure any of these disciples who became apostles ever thought the name apostle was going to be attached to their name when they were collecting taxes or fishing or doing whatever it was they were doing. But that's what happens in life when, I say from time to time, you just put one foot in front of the other in the direction that in your heart of hearts, if you're just honest with yourself, you see him pointing you in. And I've seen this happen in the lives of other folks before. Folks, it's one of the reasons why I stopped being ashamed of telling the stories. Because all I can do is tell my story. And what ended up happening was, I began to see other people take those chances too, or at least in one other circumstance. And I was really happy for them in the way it turned out. Because it's one thing if you give people advice and it becomes a complete failure, and then you're just kind of like, it's Jesus. That's why I try not to give advice, right? I try to steer away from that. But I just tell my story. And one of the problems I had when I was in the practice was no matter how well things went, Bill Parcells, the old football coach, used to say it like this. I think he was asked, Bill, what's it like coaching? He's like, there's winning and then there's misery. And so that's what it was like for me and what I did. Because if I messed up, people went to jail. Or if I messed up, fill in the blank, people lost a lot of money, right? And so it was almost like you were always trying to stave off the depression or the shame of losing. Because it's not like I just lost the football game. I lost on behalf of somebody else who had real consequences. And there's a lot of shame that goes on with that, right? And so even the wins didn't feel like wins. It just felt like I was treading water, trying not to lose. And so there's that constant pressure, right? And so now, I probably have more stress as a preacher. But here's the thing. The reason why I'm no longer ashamed to challenge people to try something outside of your career path is because I have a greater sense of peace. I can't lie about that. Even if it all changes tomorrow, having found what feels like my purpose, even though it was never part of my 5 or 10-year plan, has given me a sense of greater peace than I ever had when I was winning. God was blessing me a little bit to win, right? Win every time, that's for sure. That's not the way it works for me. But I was winning a little bit, and it wasn't right. And so that's one of the reasons why over time, I used to always deal with that preacher shame. Why are you always telling people to do it? Why are you telling, not everybody has to sacrifice that way. Not everybody does. But sometimes it's worth a try, right? So I look at brothers like Dave, right? He's got his 9 to 5, took some time away. Try something, right? And so with that, it's not like you don't have some form of precedent for people trying something, right? And so if you ask enough questions, you'll see other people. Just pray to God. Show me other people who have, if I'm not walking, this is a prayer I pray, and I tell people to be careful with it because there's certain prayers that I get so used to not seeing God answer my prayers that I just assume he's not answering them. But if you pray the ones, that's one of the reasons I talk about prayer, if you pray the ones he's willing to answer, just be ready for the answer. I passed an opportunity to go to preaching school about 3 years before I went. And I knew I was making a money choice, right? Because they weren't going to give me any financial aid, and I didn't want to go back into debt just to go back to school, even if it was for God. I'm sorry. And so I made a financial decision. But I at least prayed, God, if I'm making this decision for the wrong reasons, you can tell. I don't remember how I phrased it, but I was like, please just separate me from this opportunity if it's not for the right reasons. If you ask me in private, I'll tell you the way he separated me from that opportunity and gave me a second chance to go back to preaching school. And at that point, it was probably a more reasonable decision to go to preaching school. So it wasn't like he was punishing me. He had his timing, but he allowed it to be on my heart for the right reason. And I'm cutting. Okay. I don't want to tell so little of the story that it just sounds weird, but after I asked him not to allow me to stay on a path that did not please him, I ended up going off a trial down in South Texas one day. Got good news. We got a good result back from that trial. But as time goes, you realize that when you got too much going on, sometimes other things get neglected. So I had mail stacking up on my desk, right? And so when I got back from South Texas on the border, I was going through my mail for things that I needed to attend to. And inside one of those mail packages was a death threat filed with the court. And so with that, what ended up happening was a whole series of events that led to us having a very severe disagreement about how we were going to deal with that death threat, right? And so I'll give you all the different details, whatever. The moral of the story is be careful asking God for stuff if you're not ready for the answer. Because my answer came in the form of an envelope that changed my life, right? But I never looked back. Sometimes just ask God, not to keep you in places where your conscience is telling you, I can do better. I told you about one of my favorite content creators now. He ends up almost all of his videos with, you can do better, right? And I love that because I know I can. But that was one of the most important confessions of my life. And in a lot of ways, that marks the distinction between, I think, what we're seeing here in a whole nation is doubting. It's the scribes, etc. They're doubting in one way, but they're doubting in a way that causes them to dismiss everything that doesn't convict Jesus of something. But even his own apostles, they'll be called eventually, they're still struggling with those doubts too. And ultimately, the thing that helps them not stay in that place where they're stuck in a cycle of always looking for the worst, or stuck in a cycle of pessimism, is they're simply honest with God. It's like what is it? I forget. There's a healing we're going to see later on in the Gospels where Jesus is literally going to make it contingent on the person's faith. And he's going to say, can I? Do you believe? Or do you have the faith to be healed? And he doesn't say yes. He says, Lord, help me or help my faith, right? That's right. And so that's all he's asking us to do. Because I'm at my worst when I get offended by the question. Remember a few chapters back, we had the Canaanite woman who asked for healing for her daughter. And what did he call her? He said it's not right to give the children's food to the... Wow. Did she turn away and not get healing? She was like, sir, even the dogs eat the scraps from the table. If you want healing bad enough, the insults don't matter. And coming from Jesus, that's not an insult. He's just giving me something I need to understand about me. It's like, ooh, dog, really? Ooh, I didn't know, but, right? And that's the perspective that focuses or fixes whether or not we come to Jesus and get healing or whether we just go away mad. And so that's what he's at least got in his apostles. He's helping them to see some things. And much like, that's probably just a good enough place to end it. Just like that one person, I wish I remembered the parable offhand. You're right, you're challenging my faith, and I could give you an answer that looks good. I got a whole lot of faith. I'm supposed to have faith, right? I'm a preacher. But the reality is my faith is shook sometimes just like everybody else's. Just like my brother said, and I remembered, I just didn't remember it good. There are times when my emotions undermine my potential. And the worst part about that is because I've seen the Holy Spirit act on my behalf or on behalf of others in the body so much, I'm ashamed every time I go back to a place of doubt or disobedience or a place that has me living beneath what the Spirit is willing to do for me. And I get paid to do this. Y'all got struggles. One of the reasons it was great, not going right back into the pulpit, coming back from the mission field, is I realized, because I was doing graveyard shifts. Y'all done graveyards. I did a lot of graveyards. Did a lot of odd shifts. I had to realize, being out of the working world for about 10 years by then, I've been in ministry for 10 years by the time I came back from the mission field, I forgot what it was like to work anymore. Not that I don't, you got me. Right? But I know what it's like to try to balance some of the responsibilities that you all have. And so one of the things he's saying, one of the reasons why it was so important for me to acknowledge that part about even after they betrayed Jesus, how does he address them? He calls them brothers. Right? That's the good news. Marcus finally preached some good news this week. And all it took for them was to basically have that come to Jesus moment. That when he confronts us with a tough fact, that we don't become so wherever we are in our lives, that we can't hear it. But we simply say, God, help fill in the blank, whether it's my faith, whatever it is. Because I understand now that I'm beginning to trust you a little more. That you're not trying to embarrass me, even if my healing goes through some shame and embarrassment. You're not trying to condemn me because you could have done that already. All you're trying to do is really help me see some things that are keeping me, like we said last week, from being the kind of person that your dad wants to hang out around. That's real too casual. That your father wants to be around for eternity. And that's all the truth, as much as it hurts, is trying to do for me. So with that, somebody had a question in the young adults class this morning. Still preaching way too long. One of the questions, I forgot just that quick. Mine goes in two different directions. Preaching too long and then the young adults class. Bottom line is, I really did forget. I'm really tempted to ask the brother what he asked this morning, but I'm going to let it go. Bottom line is he loves us. And, he's not, 1 John. There's two different perspectives on love in the book of 1 John. And it's basically, look, there's a difference between the love I have for God and the love I have for people. It sounds cold, but 1 John chapter 5 describes the love that I have for God. It's defined by, am I obeying him, right? And then later on, Sean asks the question, but wait a minute, if you back up a little bit, it actually says, I can't understand whether or not I love God unless it has something to do with my people. And so understanding that my love for God in a lot of ways is demonstrated by the way in which I can overcome my tendency to withdraw and be a hermit and come out and have the kinds of relationships with people that allow them to help iron sharpens iron me, right? Because I'm no longer so wounded by all my other unhappy relationships with people that I'm not growing in the way that God is expecting me to grow. God's not going to come down here and just miraculously give me advice. My advice comes through you, right? My advice comes through my brothers and sisters. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for me to be able to get over the pain so that I can hear you and that you can hear me. As God willing, we prioritize truth over our emotions so that we can all be the kind of people that God wants to be around forever as we together stand and sing. I hear the Savior say, thy strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. I